I'm Elaine Wilson. I have spent my entire life loving looking at and doing art. I'm a writer, I'm an artist, and I am an art historian. I have taught, I have supervised, and I am doing now what I find is probably the most fulfilling part of my entire career in art, and that's lecturing to you. Today I have brought you an artist that I think you're going to find quite fascinating. Many people dispel him as just somebody who made modern art. He's a lot more than that. His name is Pablo Picasso. And Pablo Picasso ended up being, without question, the wealthiest artist who ever lived. He did his work for over 80 years. In the first part of this two-part series on his life, I will walk you through the early years of his life, and I will introduce you to his wife, to his girlfriends, to several different styles of his work. And I think as you look at it with me, you're going to understand why sometimes people get confused about who he is. And yet, when you know about him, when you know who he is, and you will, you're not confused. You might not like it, but you can appreciate it and you can understand. So let's get started with the man of the day, who is Pablo Picasso. Pablo Picasso said this: "When they tell me that I'm too old to do something, I attempt it immediately. He will live to be 91 or 92 years old. And during his lifetime, he will paint many, many pictures. He will also do many different sculptures. Later on, in a series that I'm going to be offering to you on sculpture, I will feature Picasso in one of the lessons. And Picasso does sculpture along with his paintings and his etchings and his sketches that you're going to be introduced to today. But there's so much to cover on him that I'm sticking to simply the one field today. He produced for 82 years, and in a multitude of mediums, as I've just said. And does that mean just sculpture in stone? No, wood, metal. He did ceramics, he did many different things. But let's start today with how he got interested in painting and art to begin with. As a small child, his first word wasn't mama or papa, it was pez. Lápiz is the word in Spanish for pencil, and that was his first word. Before he spoke, he was drawing. This is a painting that he did of his mother, who he was extremely close to. He did that portrait of her as a teenager. When he was 15, he did this piece. And it was entered in a competition. It's called First Communion. He knew something about this because he had served as an altar boy in his church. He also did this piece the following year. And this one is called Science and Charity. And if you notice, there's a nun holding a child and a cup of something hot that they're offering to the woman who's in bed. And the woman who's in bed is being attended to by a physician. What it looks like he's checking her pulse. Notice something. Those two men are the same. I have just introduced you to his mother and his father, because his father willingly posed for him. His father was a professor, an art professor, and his father also certainly promoted him studying art. And when he was 15, 16, 17, he took an exam that students took to enter the Madrid School of Art. And older students took this, and it took the test, and it took them about 3 days to finish it. Picasso did it all in one day and flew through it with flying colors. My point, it seems like he not only has always been interested in art, but he also has been very talented. And no, this is not his mother who's sick in bed. This is a painting that he did. You're going to find as I go along that as he continues to work, he tries very hard to not tell stories. You can make one up from this or from this, but he will try to give you images and allow you to make up your own story. He stole from the best. He liked the work that was done by Renoir. You've seen some in the past. There's one. And he also liked the style of Monet. Now, would he copy this? No. But he would use it to create his image or interpretation of that scene. Over here, he does this scene of Paris. He has the small people. He has the speckled effect that you get with Impressionism. He was capable of working at an early age. He was capable of working in many different styles. Degas was an artist that he especially appreciated, and in fact, during his lifetime, collected a lot of work done by Degas. And in this image, you can see Degas' work, and you can see Picasso's. Degas was French. She looks French. Picasso was Spanish. She looks Spanish. But neither one of them has much expression on their face, and in both cases, the backgrounds are rather nondescript. He was learning, he was copying, but he was copying with his own interpretations. An artist that he adored was Toulouse-Lautrec. There's the little guy. There's his earliest poster, and here's one that Picasso does. And this poster is a poster that shows his art dealer, Manche. And if you notice something about these two, look at this. He stole the flat colors that Toulouse-Lautrec had used. He used the lettering like Lautrec had allowed himself to use. And he does wonderful fine line work. It is amazing that Picasso would do all this and then still go on to create beyond what these men have created, works that the world heretofore had never seen before. When he was 20 years old, he and his friend Carlos Casagamos had been studying in Spain and decided that since the center of the art world was France, that they needed to be in Paris. And so they rent a very small flat in Paris. It has one cot. Casagamos sleeps in the cot at night, and Picasso sleeps in the cot in the daytime. And so at night, Picasso painted, and during the day, Carlos painted. But this shows a scene called Death at a Funeral, which is a painting that he did of his friend. This is the tragedy. Look at this. Maybe you hadn't noticed it, but now you will. There's a hole in his head. Carlos commits suicide. And Carlos commits suicide in a cafe. He has fallen in love with a woman named Germaine, and she has refused to marry him. And so he takes a gun, and his friends, including Picasso and Germaine, all attended together in the afternoons at a certain cafe in Paris. They all arrive. Casagamos picks his time, pulls a revolver out, aims it at Germaine because he's going to shoot her, because nobody will have her if he can't. And when he misses, he commits suicide. Picasso is devastated by this. He will do 4 different paintings of his friend's suicide. I only show you one, and trust me, this is probably the least sensitive one that you can see. But notice here, the yellow, light reflecting, the blue areas of death. It was a terrible time, and it will create a hole in Picasso's heart that's never quite filled especially during the early years following Carlos's suicide. The first period that we can mark for Picasso will be the period following the death of his friend Castellanos. And here is a portrait that he does of himself during that time. He sees himself age. She's only in his early 20s. And he represents loneliness, despair, isolation. My goodness, this was a man who had studied with him in Spain. This is a man that he was so close to, and now he's dead. And Picasso starts a series of paintings called the Blue Period. There are all kinds of ideas as to why everything is blue. One of them is because the flat that they lived in was so cold that it made him feel that color. Another one is that the color blue, and it's true, its pigments are less costly than some of the finer, richer, brighter colors. And so that was certainly the case because he didn't have money. But the other thing is, he was showing his loneliness, not only with himself, but with the images that he creates. If you notice the woman, she's just holding, she's clutching herself. This man who's playing the guitar is blind. And over here, this one called Life, look what he has done with this piece. This piece is very, very different from this one. Out of all of his Blue Period, this piece, done in 1901, is probably the lighter-hearted, kinder piece. But notice what happens here 2 years later. The woman is holding her child, and she's looking into the future and wondering what will ever happen to this child. The couple are standing there. Yes, they are nude. He's got something on here. But they are standing here. She's clinging to him, and he's not responding at all. He also is separated and alone. And that is the face, again, of his friend, Carlos Castellanos. Behind them and between them are two other figures. We don't know if they're men or women or a man and a woman, but they're huddled together trying to save themselves. And down at the bottom, when all hope is gone, here you have this one, just wrapped up as tight as possible into himself. So these were sad times for him. However, life does have balance. And along comes Ferdinand Oliver. He called her the purring cat. Ferdinand had a habit of doing a little top knot on the top of her head. She doesn't have it here, but she does have it up here. And here is a painting that he does of Ferdinand that more resembles that piece. But here are some others as well. Ferdinand had a bad childhood and ended up living with an aunt who despised her. So at a very early age, she married a man who also turned out to be abusive. And so she ran away from him. And it was at this point that she bumped into Picasso. And Picasso saw her as somebody who would probably make a good model because that's what she had been doing in Paris to make some money for herself. And when she started to model for Picasso, he forbid her to model for anybody else. He wanted her to himself. I want you to notice her in this picture and him. How do I know it's him? Because time after time after time, he will show himself in a harlequin costume or the hat. So it's a way to kind of mark him through time, clear to the very end of his life. And as he was moving through his life, he had different women. He had a lot of different women. In my two-part series, I've only picked out 6 or 7. They are the ones that were there with him for the longest periods of time. Fernanda will be with him for 7 years. But as he moves through the different women, you'll also notice that he moves through different phases of his life. His feelings for Fernande are just kind of recorded. You're going to find some where the faces of the women are really quite grotesque. But there were times when he was very, very unhappy with whoever was sharing his life. Fernande comes along, and she is the marker that brings him from the blue period into the rose period. And here are three examples of that. This is her. Look at the little top knot. Here she is again with the top knot. And there he is. And both of them looking in different directions. Fernande was not a Rhodes Scholar. Her biggest interests were hats and perfume. And then after that, just resting and lounging around. I include The Child with the Dove because he did that in 1901. And in 1949, a world organization asked Picasso if he would do a symbol for them. And he had been gifted by that time with 2 doves from his friend slash enemy, Matisse. And he had the doves in his studio, and so he thought that might make a good idea for a peace symbol. And yes, not only did it make a good idea in 1949, but in 2020, we still see the dove representing peace. The Boy with the Pipe is a piece that sold in 2004 for $1 million. And the Boy with the Pipe is not somebody that's a figment of his imagination. That boy used to come to his studio and sit and smoke his pipe and just watch Picasso work. And he made a perfect transition, doesn't he, with going from the blue to the rose colors. So he's now into another period of his life. At the foot of the hill in Montmartre, there was a circus. And Picasso would go down and he would enjoy the circus. But then he started following the entertainers backstage. And he started to talk to them. And he realized what sad, isolated lives they really felt that they lived. The public wanted them for amusement and entertainment and a nice evening or afternoon out. But that's all. And after that was over, they didn't want to have any more to do with them at all. And the entertainers could feel that. Look at this mother and child. And on the plate, a meager amount of food. He felt the distress and the sadness of these people with their lives. And so one of the major pieces that he will do in 1905 is a piece called The Family of Saltimbanque. And it is a piece that takes us now from the Rose period into what's called the Circus period, because he will do a number of pieces related to the circus. And I say down here at the bottom, this painting relates to a condition, not a story. You cannot make a story out of this that Picasso would want you to understand. You can make out of it whatever you choose. That is what he would desire. You'll notice that he is there in his Harlequin costume, and he's holding the hand of a little girl who has a basket beside her. There's a jester beside him with a sack on his shoulder, and there's a man with a can on his back and a little costume. And here's a small child with a flower in his hand. And here's a woman over here whose hat is kind of hovering around the top of her head. And over here is a jug. And if this piece looks like it's not finished by your standards or mine, it isn't. And when this piece has been x-rayed, they have found that it changed a number of different times as he worked through his ideas for it. But this is how he finally left it. And notice that there is one thing that calls out as you look at this piece, and that is loneliness and disassociation. Not one of those figures is looking at you. Not one of those figures is looking at each other. What can you get from this? Nothing. It's just background. So again, it's important to keep in mind as you look at Picasso's work that he will not tell you stories, but he will tell you conditions. Here's the size of this piece. I think this is quite an impressive size painting. And here's another one just to give you an idea of the work that he did during this period, because it wasn't just a one and done thing. He did a number of circus pieces. I only pick out a few from each period so that I can get through some of the volume of his work in the first half of his life in 1 hour. But here is the Harlequin figure and the hat, and there is the jester and the jester's cap, and what is around them? Maybe a city, maybe not. I have spoken before in lectures on about Gertrude Stein. This is when she lived and when she died. She was a great American writer. By 1901, she had moved to Paris, where she lived permanently, although she flitted back and forth between France and the United States a number of times. But Gertrude Stein was famous for her wonderful parties, and when she had parties, she invited the best of the best writers and composers and artists, and Picasso was certainly included. Well, to one of her soirees, he took Fernande. And Gertrude Stein said to him later, "You know, Fernande is very interesting to meet. And after that, there is nothing left to say." She was just tired she got very quickly bored with Fernande's concerns about hats and perfume, because Fernande really didn't think about much besides that. Now I have a sign up here that said Gertrude Stein 1906, because in 1906 he does this painting of her. She has asked him if he would do this for her, and then had no idea that he was going to ask her to come between 90 and 100 times to pose for this painting. And finally, in the last sitting, he took a cloth, dipped it in turpentine, smeared out her face, and said, "I cannot see you for looking at you. Leave. I'll finish this, I'll send it when it's done." So that is exactly what happened. And she was leaving shortly thereafter to come back to the States for a little while. So sooner or later, she got the painting. And when she got the painting, she was really disgusted. This is Gertrude Stein. Look what he's shown her as. And she said, "This is not me." Well, here is a picture of Gertrude later in life, and there is this painting. And when Picasso learned that she was going to keep the painting, but she was really not very happy about it, and that she was happy because it didn't look like her, he said, "Gertrude, it's a painting of you, and you will look like that." And guess what, folks? Gertrude does. This is a very important piece. You're going to see this enlarged in the next image, but here, just to give you some background on it, he decided he wanted to do a scene which in English is The Young Woman of Avignon. And these young women were prostitutes. And he decides that he has to get some good sketches done, so he spent 6 weeks working on sketches for this particular large painting. It's 8 by 7. And then he spent 9 months painting and repainting it to get it the way he wanted it to be. Now, Avignon is a section in southern France, but it is also a street where prostitutes were famous for waiting for customers, in Barcelona. So this is the young woman of Avignon in Barcelona. This is not Avignon in southern France. This turns out to be the most famous of all Cubist paintings ever done. But it turns out to be like that. It didn't start out that way. Now, at the time that he did this, he was 25 years old. He was still living in Montmartre, maybe still in that same little cramped studio that he and Castigamas and then Ferdinand had shared. But he gets the painting finished and nobody seems to be interested in it. And finally his art dealer says in 1916, oh, let me show it and let's see what happens. Well, what happened was disastrous. His friend enemy, Matisse, came and said that he had, Picasso in one painting had totally destroyed any progress for modern art. And another friend of his, Duran, said that the best they could do was to find Picasso, hang him to death behind the painting, and walk away, that it was just that awful. So the painting goes back to his studio, and it lays rolled up in a corner for a long time. And it's really not accepted until the 1920s. Actually, I would move that date into the 30s. But here are some sketches before I go to the painting on a larger scale for you to see. He didn't start out with this being a woman. This is going to be a young man who's like a doctor with his coat on, carrying a skull. And here he's done an extra portrait of his face. And then of the women, I picked out one for you to see, and this woman did not have this quasi-natural looking face. Initially, he had done her to look this way. You can see the lines on her arm coming up here. He didn't leave anything out, even to the bowl of fruit, which you may have missed because there's so much other so many other interesting areas to consider. But he left nothing out of this painting. He considered everything when he was working on it. He had been to see an exhibit of African art in Paris before he started this painting, and it kind of encouraged him to consider making a couple of the women, these two especially, who had faces more like this, turn them into masks. And so that's what he does. So 2 months after he has quote unquote finished this painting, he goes back in and he makes their faces masks. This is his first Cubist painting. And this will be an incredibly famous piece by the time this is all over, even though it had laid curled up on the floor in his studio for 13 years. You might also find this interesting. Germaine, the woman who missed being shot by Castigamas, there she is. He put her in the painting too. There is the size of the painting. And this is taken at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Because the Museum of Modern Art around 1936 bought that painting far into the future. They were looking ahead to see what might survive, and somebody thought this might be one of the pieces that would be a marker in all of art history, and the museum bought it, and it is still theirs, and it certainly is an incredibly interesting piece of work, but very cubistic in its style. Cubism means that you can see more than one side of something at the same time, and I'll point that out a little bit more as we go along here. During Picasso's lifetime, he only has one person that he really has any close affinity to as far as collaborating on work is concerned. And that is George Braque. That's this man right here. George Braque and he will collaborate on using collage, which are found pieces of whatever in the street, along with Cubism, to create works like this. Now, this particular piece, of course, the rope is real, collage. Of course, the caning for the seat is real. And then these things, of course, they're added or they're painted. They're pasted on or they're painted on. So it's collage and it's cubism, and it's showing single objects from more than one angle at one time. Picasso really appreciated George Braque. Picasso was a very short man. George Braque was 6 feet tall. He was a boxer. He played the concertina. He was a biker. He was also a very gifted artist. He will not go on to other fields of endeavor. He's going to stick with Cubism, but during the time that he works with Picasso, there are times when you can't tell who has done the painting. And in some cases, they didn't sign their work, so we really do not know. Paul Cézanne also interested Picasso, and these are some of the pieces I've shown you before when I discussed him. This is what Picasso does. And who's the lady? Fernande. She's still around. He's made her cubistic, but he's taken this table and he's put that in the background behind it. So he's paying tribute to Cézanne, but he is also experimenting with a woman whose features he is quite familiar with and chiseling them and changing them to create a feeling of cubism in the work. Oh, this sweetheart. This is Eva. Her real name was Marcel, but he called her Ma Jolie, which means my pretty one. He called her an intellectual poodle. She was very intelligent, and she was just a sweet little thing. He'd like to cuddle up with her. She won't be in his life for very long, shorter period than Fernande, not 7 years, but only 3. But she's with him during some of the time that he's still working with George Braque. He does this sketch of her. He does this painting of her. And he does this painting of her later. Unfortunately for him, the year 2000, or the year 1913, was not a good year. His father died that year. His mother is still alive, but his father died that year. And it was the same year that Eva was diagnosed with tuberculosis. And by 1915, she is hospitalized permanently, and she does pass. He is very caring and he is very good to her during that period of time, but he is also considering moving on with his future because he knows that she will not be sharing it. He actually took this photograph of her. He just wanted her in a Japanese kimono. He thought that would be fun. Here's Picasso and George Braque. Picasso, Braque. How can you tell the difference? They're working very, very much alike. They will work monochromatically, as these pieces represent, or sometimes they will work in color. Here's one that's much more colorful, and this one also subdued, but some color in it. And here's Eva again. And he's done this piece of her. And in this piece, he had a habit with Eva. He didn't do it with the others, and he won't do it with the others so much. He had a habit of putting "I love you, Eva" into his paintings, or "Ma Jolie, my pretty one." He'll put that into his paintings of her. She always held a very special part in his heart. And when she died, he had decided he had to get away. And so he took a place outside of Paris, and he got to the point where he was still trying to work through that depression of losing her, and he would only go out at night. He would stay in during the daytime, and then he would walk at night, trying to get over the fact that he had lost such a precious little intellectual poodle that had been a part of his life. By the year 1917, he is recovering, and he has gone to Italy. And he's gone there to work for Diaghilev, and he's going to be doing backdrops for him for his ballets. This turns out to be his largest painting ever, and it's a backdrop for a ballet. Going to Italy to do the largest painting he ever did, was not all that happened to him there. He met this little sweetheart, and he does this picture of her. Her name is Olga. She was a ballerina. Now, Diaghilev had an interesting way of selecting his ballerinas. He selected women who were good-looking, but also extremely talented. And then he picked ones who were talented to some extent, but extremely beautiful. So he had the balance. And she is one who is picked by him because she is extremely beautiful, capable as a ballerina, but very, very beautiful. Picasso fell in love with her, and so in 1918, they got married. There is a picture that he did of her, and here comes another one. When he married her, he took her back to Spain so his mother, who's still alive, could meet her. And his mother did not like her. She was Ukrainian. Her last name was Kotakova. And she was not somebody that Picasso's mother felt would really make a good wife for him. So he does this painting showing Olga in a Spanish headdress to hopefully encourage his mother to think better of her. It didn't do it, but he at least tried. However, his mother was right, because Olga will end up having no eyes for his art and no soul for him. Here is a short version of a long story. This is a portrait that he did of Olga in 1923, and this was one after they had separated. This is one he did of her in 1935. Really was still not happy with her. But look at this. She came from the Ukraine. Her father had been a Tsarist colonel, and of course she had studied ballet, and she had gotten a position with a ballet company. She had been spoiled rotten as a child. She had a haughty, snobbish attitude, and she was very definitely a social climber. She loved the money that she knew Picasso had and that he would be making more. And she loved the glamour of being Mrs. Pablo Picasso. Now that's hardly enough to hold a marriage together. And this doesn't help either. When they moved to Paris, he rented 2 different floors in an apartment building. One floor was for him, and the other floor was for her. Now, yes, he could go downstairs and they would entertain, they would have parties and friends, but he was not allowed to bring any of his art downstairs. His art all had to stay up in his apartment. She wanted no part of it. She had no interest in his career. She only had interest in what the career could bring, which was money and glamour and a social position. So hard times befell this marriage early on. However, they will have a child, and his name will be Pablo. And when the child is born, Picasso resorts to some of these absolutely lovely, tender pieces of mothers and children. Pablo was born in 1921, and he was about 3 years old when this piece was done. And notice that Picasso dresses him in a Harlequin costume because Pablo is his son. He finally can't take it anymore. Here's an interesting picture of the 2 of them together. I think it's kind of nice. I don't know at what point in time, I couldn't get the date on it, but this is certainly a happier time than around 1929 when he just couldn't take it anymore, so he left. And she wanted a divorce, and she said that she wanted half of everything he had and would have. And he, of course, wasn't going to do that. So he just left her, and she ended up going to Cannes. And in 1954, she has uterine cancer and she dies. But they are married until 1954. So all of the women that come along between 1929 and 1954, he can't marry them because he already has a wife, although he really has very little to do with her at all, and some to do with Pablo. Here are some of his pictures that he did of Pablo. Sweet child. And the pictures that show Pablo often will show him wearing the Harlequin costume. During Picasso's lifetime, he will take three, and I can't tell you which three they were, but he will take three of his many interpretations of his son Pablo, and he will keep them with him until his death. And when Pablo grows up to be close to his father, he applies for the job of being a chauffeur, and that's what he does. I'll be talking next time, about Picasso's last years and his death and the debacle that happened over all that. But to give you just a little background here, Pablo marries. He and his wife have 3 children. And then those children have issues. Pablo and his wife both die because they are alcoholics. The one daughter of Pablo's takes her inheritance that she will get from Picasso's estate eventually and starts an orphanage, which she still runs in Vietnam. But one of her brothers, who's is not allowed to attend the funeral of his grandfather, drinks bleach outside the gates of the place where the funeral is going to be held and kills himself. So some tragedies occur along the line with that section of the family. He goes into a classical period in 1923, and this started because he was spending time in Italy. He's seeing the work of certainly Michelangelo and some of the other great artists, and he starts to paint pictures of people that are rather robust and sturdy looking, and he does a lot of scenes that represent the beach because he's in that part of the world. And here are some that he does. Now, with the exception of these 2, you can't really tell where those people are, but it's a carefree time for him in some ways, and it's also a time for him to try a new approach to painting. And his intention was to eventually take these figures and have them sculpted so that they can be positioned along a beach. That never happens, but it was certainly an idea that he had. It was part of what's called his classical period. Now, along comes this darling woman named Marie-Therese Walter. She's Spanish. She's living in France. She comes out of a department store. She's 17 years of age. Picasso is 45. It's 1927. And he sees her. And she's a good-sized girl. He called her voluptuous, and goes over to her and he says, my name is Pablo Picasso, and I think you and I are going to make great things happen together. Well, that sold her on him, and off they went, and they were together for 9 years. During this time, he will do many paintings of her, and you can pretty much tell if it's her or not in a painting by the blonde hair, because of all of the women that are close to him. There's only another one. There's one called Sylvette that has a ponytail, but that is definitely not Marie-Therese. But the blonde hair is usually a sign that it's Marie-Therese. And here are two others that he does of her in color. Now I'm going to take these two and enlarge them for you so you can see them a little better. At the time that he does these, she is 22 years of age, so they've lived together for 4 years. And he does this one that's called A Dream. It's fascinating because it's her profile, but it's her whole face. And he does wonderful things with how he works with line. Remember Toulouse-Lautrec? Although he had the friend-of-me kind of relationship with Matisse, he will do this painting and look at all of the pattern that Matisse was so famous for and all of the textures that he adds to this piece. This was one that he did in one afternoon. And this one's curious because it shows Marie-Therese as a very young woman with a long blonde hair, and older, and then aged. And it's hard to tell. We have to make up our own stories. If she is pushing the mirror away to hold off age, or she is bringing it closer so she can see into the future. But it's an interesting piece, and it's always been, internationally, it's been quite a fascinating piece for people to look at and to appreciate. In fact, that's the case with both of them. Maria-Therese will become pregnant with a child. So Maya is born in 1935. So now Picasso has a little boy born in 1921, and he now has a little girl born in 1935. And here are some pictures that he does of Maya. Maya was a sweetheart, and Maria-Therese at one point wrote, the daughter of whom he's very much in love. And Picasso standing there in his little robe, holding a puppy, and Maya is standing in front of him. Maria-Therese held up hope all of her life that Picasso would eventually marry her, that he would divorce Olga or something would happen. This is Maya with the doll. This is Maya with the sailboat up here. And this is just a very sensitive charcoal piece that he did. But for her entire life, Maria-Therese loved Picasso. And I wrote up here, after his death, and he dies in 1973, 4 years later, she committed suicide. She went to an empty garage in Paris in 1977 and hanged herself. It was as if there was no one left for her, and so she couldn't take it anymore. So that's what unfortunate thing happened to her. In the meantime, in their years together, you're looking at some of the other examples of the work that he did that features her. Here you see her asleep, and here you see her on a pedestal. She wore her hair this way a lot. You can see it here again, and also over here. So once you're familiar with that, when you see pictures of women that Picasso has done, it's easy to know about what time period and with whom he was engaged when the work was done. This is Maria-Therese Walter. And now you have Maya, and you have Maya's daughter, Diana. In the next presentation, I will discuss in some detail this particular painting because it is an incredible political statement, and it's one of the very few that Picasso will produce. Picasso lives in France and in Paris during the German occupation in World War II. He tries very hard to become a French citizen, and for some time that privilege is denied him. because his fear is that the Spanish will not make peace with the Germans, and the Germans will, at the end of the war, win, clean out the city, and Picasso will end up in a concentration camp. But why am I showing you this piece today? Because I want you to notice that figure. That is Maya and her mother. This is Maria Therese, and this is Maya. And this screaming woman, this mother, is running carrying her dead child. I'll give you the whole story on this the next time and point these out again. But just so you know what the relationship is here. Besides that, there is Maya again, and the dark-haired woman beside her is Maya's daughter, Diana. Diana's still alive. Diana is a socialite, and Diana is extremely well known in the world of art for her knowledge about her father's sculpture. And as I said, you'll see an entire program on that coming up in 3 or 4 weeks or longer. Anyway, these women, all 3 of these women, in one way or another, played critical roles in the life of Pablo Picasso. As for him himself, as he was painting and interpreting the women that he surrounded himself with, he also kept interpreting himself and often used the Harlequin figure. Now here you can see the Harlequin hat, not the diamonds costume, but the hat. And of course this is Olga and Pablo. And you can tell it's Olga, she's got on the ballet slippers. And he really felt that often, and he will have another alter ego as well that I'll show you next time. But this Harlequin figure, he felt represented him. The Harlequin was always coming up with new things to do on the stage, and he said, if a Harlequin can walk across the stage and get people's attention, don't you think that the Harlequin will turn cartwheels or flips or do splits or do something that will even enhance his awareness on the stage for the audience all the more? And of course, this is certainly the thing that Picasso does. Now, this piece up here, it's black. It has an unfinished painting. It has the Harlequin figure. And it was done shortly after his beloved Eva had died. His heart was broken by that. This also dashed him when Casagamas committed suicide right there in the cafe in front of everybody. And so he's still working through that. And so that picture from the Blue Period was done representing himself and him trying to come to grips with the loss that he suffered in his life. He does many portraits during his lifetime. I'll point out a few that cover the period that I have talked with you about this time. This one is interesting. He was 19 when he did this. He had just gotten to Paris, and it's called Yo Picasso, I Picasso. Why? Because his father's name was Ruiz, R-U-I-Z. So his last name should have been that. This is his mother's family name. Now, why didn't he keep his father's name? Well, the Ruiz family in Spain was noted for their beautiful leather goods, especially gloves. And Picasso, Pablo, did not want to be associated with that at the expense of everything else, and so he thought, I'll drop my father's name, and I will simply call myself Pablo Picasso. He actually had, his official name, he had about 19 names, and I saved you the torture of trying to put all of those up on the screen for you to see. But this is at about the time that he decides that he is going to go, not as Pablo Ruiz Picasso, but as Pablo Picasso. This is a piece that he did during the war years. I mentioned them to you. And this is what he's thinking about. Is he going to end up in a concentration camp? Can he get some kind of reprieve from the French government? And notice the blue and white shirt. It's a sailor shirt. And he makes this very famous. He wears these shirts all the time, not every day, but these are part of his signature wardrobe. So he shows himself wearing that, but also in a state of distress. Now I want to show you another one. Look at this. He does this a year before he dies. I think it speaks volumes without me saying a word about it. Here are two more. I want you to notice in all of these pictures the eyes. His eyes are staring at you. The exception is here, where he doesn't even know where to look because he's so distraught about the war and the devastation that's around him and that's been caused. And this piece, he wants to hang on to life. I opened this by saying, he said, if anybody tells me I'm too old to do something, I do it immediately. And he kept painting, working to the very last day of his life. But he can see that his life is shorter now than it was here, or back here, or even over here. And he's starting to show that in his work. So far, this is what I have covered with you, very cursory style. I'm sorry about that, but there's so much that I could go into. I've talked a little about his early life and his success at the university with taking a 3-day test in 1 day. I talked about his blue period in Castellanos and his rose period in Fernande and his circus period and his sympathy with those people and his cubist period when he worked with George Braque, the only man he ever collaborated with on any of his styles of painting. And I spoke about the classical period, which is an extension of his time in Italy, and of course that's the time when he met his future wife. I have spoken to you about the purring cat, which is Fernande. I have spoken to you about Eva, the intellectual poodle. I have spoken to you about Olga and Pablo, and how estranged they became for their adult lives, for most of their adult lives, because they really, they were not on the same wavelength. Picasso and Olga not want the same things from life. And then I've spoken about the tender, sweet Maria Therese and Maya. Fernande is French. She's French. She's Ukrainian. He's Spanish. He's international in his choice of women. But his women all represent to him subjects for his paintings. And one of the things that is difficult to accept, but certainly true, of Picasso is something that is said about him frequently. And he said that women are either goddesses or doormats. And when any of them, Eva never had the chance, but any of them would become doormats, that was a time when he would become abusive, not necessarily physically abusive, but abusive in ways that he disappeared. When Maria Therese and Maya, when Maria Therese, before she had Maya, was in love with Picasso, Picasso and Olga were living across the street from her apartment in France, and she agreed to go over and be the nurse for Pablo so she could be closer to Picasso. And it wasn't hard to do because Picasso was upstairs in a different studio and Olga didn't mind at all. Maria Therese will finally, when she becomes pregnant with Maya, Olga will find out about this, and that will create quite a barnstorm and a lot of trouble. But neither one of them neither one of them live on to live out their lives happily with this man that in their early years has really stolen their hearts. He said this one time, "It's up to the public to see what it wants to see." And the whole time I've been speaking, I've left this image of Maria Therese up here for you. She's sleeping. It's really simple. It's red and green. It's a little yellow here and some purplish blue, some tint on her lips, a lot of line work. But you decide. You decide what you want to see in that painting. He did not like to tell people stories with his paintings. He wanted people to make up their own. If you have any questions or comments that you would like to ask me, please contact either the Willow Valley website, or you can be in touch with me at laineyLW@gmail.com. Next week I will be speaking about this woman, whose name is Dora Maar, along with some others, and it will be the second and last part in the life of Pablo Picasso. If you would like a handout on this lecture, please be in touch with Ask Presenter, willowvalley.org, and they will be glad to ship something out to you. It is a handout that covers both phases of Part 1 and Part 2. So there's only one handout for that, although the write-up can be, and the pictures can be slightly different. Now, I hope you've enjoyed learning some things about Picasso. I don't expect you to like his work. I don't expect you to like his lifestyle. I just expect you to try to understand him. That is really an important part of our lives, because we just can't love everybody in the world. But if we can understand them, it makes our lives and their lives so much better. Next week we'll go on and explore a little more about this genius, 10 people, different people, all one person wrapped together, Spanish artist, the wealthiest artist who ever lived, Pablo Picasso. I'll see you next week. Thank you. Be safe. Bye-bye.